Mottram from the Victorian Fisheries Authority. I'm your chair for this afternoon, and the key job, I suppose, is to keep things moving. Then we'll do the questions there at the end. We've got a bit of time for the questions, so we'll keep the crew moving. First speaker is Ash Fowler. So welcome, Ash. Thanks very much for presenting. Going to talk about integrating recreational fishing into harvest strategies. So take it away, Ash.
Will do. Thanks very much, Brian. So I'm just going to outline a little bit of research that we've been doing on including recreational fishing in harvest strategies, but I'm just going to focus on trying to work out exactly what fishers want and how we can actually possibly achieve that now and into the future. I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors on the various studies that I'm going to cover today. It's quite a diverse team. It's been really good to be a part of that. Also the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation and the New South Wales Recreational Fishing Trust as well, who made all this possible. So I'll just start with an overview of exactly what a harvest strategy is. So they're currently considered best practice management at the moment, and they're being adopted throughout fisheries throughout the globe, including fisheries that include recreational fishing. I just thought I'd demystify it a little bit. Essentially, a harvest strategy is just a strategy that is designed to achieve a fishery objective or more than one fishery objective. And essentially, an objective is just what stakeholders want out of the fishery. That could be high catch rates, or it could be large catches in and of themselves, or it might be something that's mandated, so sustainable biomass or something like that. And in their simplest form, you might derive a single performance indicator for one of your objectives. That just allows you to track the performance of the fishery against your objective through time. Okay, and a performance indicator is just a variable really, and it can be whatever variable is fit for purpose. I'll go back. So along with your performance indicator, you want to establish reference points for your indicator as well. So you might need to define a high value that you want to strive for in your fishery for that variable. Might be 10 fish a day. That catch rate, for example, is something everybody wants. That is often referred to as a target reference point. That's the top dotted line there. And you also want to define a limit reference point probably. So a value where you don't want the fishery to ever get to. And that's this lower dotted line down here. And so once you have all those things, essentially we enter into a bit of a monitoring, assessment and harvest control cycle. So you just monitor that indicator through time, you assess it against your reference points, and then you apply harvest control accordingly to drive your indicator towards the target and away from the limit. And the innovation of harvest strategies is that those harvest controls are hardwired into the values of your performance indicator. So unlike previously where you get down here towards your limit reference point, everybody wonders how we're going to respond and what we're going to do, and there's a lot of heated emotions. At that point, you should already know what the harvest control is going to be, and given it's your limit reference point, it's probably going to be something fairly drastic, like stopping targeted fishing, for example. So where does recreational fishing fit in here? Well, we know that recreational fishing is globally important, but interestingly, it's not particularly well governed. We've heard quite a lot of that at the conference so far. And the harvest strategies are no exception here. Harvest strategies were traditionally applied to large and valuable commercial fisheries, and recreational fishing and recreational sectors were rarely included. But as you're probably aware, we really need to account for all sources of mortality on a stock in a multi-sector fishery, and we also need to make sure that we have equitable fisheries performance across all the sectors that all equally value a resource. If you leave one of these sectors out in your harvest strategy development, then it's much less likely you're going to achieve the objectives for that particular sector. So the research areas that we've been investigating, I'll just touch on them now, and that's what will sort of structure the talk. We conducted a review of recreational fishing objectives from the scientific literature, essentially trying to get at this question of what recreational fishers actually want, at least according to the literature. We then wanted to actually talk to real recreational fishers, God forbid, and we wanted to identify stock-specific recreational fishing objectives for 3 key stocks in New South Wales. So that's the mulloway, yellowtail kingfish and pink snapper. And then on top of that, we wanted to identify which of those objectives they came up with were more important than others. Unfortunately, the reason we need to do this is because harvest strategies don't do particularly well if you throw 30 objectives in there. They just functionally break down. You need a much smaller number. People say less than 10, but I suspect, depending on the computational complexity, it's probably around 5 or less. And then what we did was link those recreational fishing objectives to existing data sources in New South Wales, Australia. So if we came up with these objectives and someone told us tomorrow to come up with a harvest strategy that includes them, do we actually have the data sources and the data series to monitor them right now? And And on the flip side of that, if we don't, what do we need to scramble to get together for recreational data in the future? Okay, so moving on to the results of the review, we ended up with 22 broad objectives here from the scientific literature. We can always think of more, I'm sure, but these were the ones that really popped out all the time. They're super broad. I mean, look at number 1, catch fish. Couldn't get more broad than that, really. So obviously we needed to break down these broad objectives into a series of specific objectives, things that we can actually measure against and understand the fishery performance. So just to give you an example, catching large or trophy fish was one of them. And we broke that down into 2 things that could possibly be measured. So maximising the size of fish caught and also maximising the likelihood of encountering a large fish. Slightly different but related concepts. We also then wanted to work out, of those specific objectives, which ones we actually think can be achieved in a harvest strategy and which can't. There's no point chasing the dragon on this one. If it can't be done in a harvest strategy, we need to know early and we need to put it aside and put it in the management arrangement and management processes where it really belongs. So in order to be achieved in a harvest strategy, that objective and performance related to it really needs to be affected by harvest. So as you move harvest up and down, there's some change in the performance of the fishery in respect to the objective itself. So just to provide an example here, maximise the number of trips where a fish is caught. This is something we could arguably achieve in a harvest strategy, or at least monitor against. And the reason we can is because you can imagine if you decreased harvest, you give the stock a chance to rebuild, you therefore increase the abundance of fish out there and increase the likelihood of encountering those individuals on trips. So there's some way to wire that one in. Contrast to something like maximising access to fishing locations. Really important recreational fishing objective, no doubt, but it's hard to see how we can push that one around and get performance against it when we move harvest up and down. So this is one we suggested might be done more successfully in the broader management strategy that encompasses the harvest strategy itself. All right, moving on to stock-specific objectives. So we held workshops with experienced recreational fishers in New South Wales to identify their objectives for kingfish, snapper and mulloway, those 3 stocks I mentioned before. Unlike this cosy photo down here, this was the height of COVID, so we had to hold these workshops as a series of online sessions. Obviously we had the recreational fishers there attending, but we also had fisheries managers and fisheries scientists along to enable the process. And essentially we just co-developed lists of objectives with them and spent quite a lot of time with recreational fishers trying to understand what they wanted for these particular stocks. And we developed for each stock a broad list, so everything you could ever imagine you might want to achieve in your fishery for that particular stock. And then also a harvest strategy shortlist. So just identifying those objectives we considered as a project team that could possibly be achieved in a harvest strategy. Okay, so this is just an example of the harvest strategy shortlist for one of our species, the pink snapper. It's a bit busy, I suppose, but you don't need to look at all the detail. Just to note that we had a hierarchy of objectives to help comprehension. So broad objectives, ecological, economic and social, and then sub-objectives and then specific objectives underneath those. So let's look quickly at the ecological, ensure a sustainable fishery, no kidding. So, I mean, that one is broken into at least 6 different specific objectives that help likely achieve that sub-objective and contribute to ecological objectives as a whole. Economics, well, sorry, I'll just point out a few things here, I suppose. So maintaining enough fish overall to ensure a healthy stock, yep. Ensuring a decent proportion of the stock can reach a maximum size and also a legal size. Ensuring protection of spawning aggregations, and for pink snapper specifically, it was rebuilding stocks in habitats previously known to sport fish in New South Wales. So there's a mix of generic things in there that you're probably all very familiar with, but this one was particular to that stock. Economics, we had a lot of sub-objectives here that really didn't require further specialisation right now. However, we did note that obviously if you're trying to generate economic value for a recreational fishing industry, you might want to consider what's going on with the different subsectors within that industry. So we broke it down into charter fishing and fishing tackle industries, at least as a start. Social, again, there are more social objectives here. I just wanted to point out the lower one there, which we all know and love, which is improving the recreational fishing experience. And really the anglers bore out the fact that you have multiple components that make up this recreational fishing experience and how you might measure performance against it. So what did we find? Well, we found that recreational objectives were broadly aligned with those of other sectors. phew, what a relief, because if they weren't, we'd have to put separate objectives in for all different sectors, including different ones for recreational. And as I said, we have that kind of operational cap of the number of objectives we can service in a harvest strategy. So if we can combine them across sectors, if they've got some common goals, the more the better. And so an example there is maintaining stock biomass. Obviously that's good for everybody. You can fight about exactly where the target reference point is among sectors, but at least the common objective is there. Next one, recreational fishing objectives were similar among those three stocks, despite them being fished in relatively different ways and also in different areas a lot of the time. So that's also good because it suggests we don't need to dedicate a lot of resources into developing lists of objectives for each species that we come across for recreational fishing as they pop up in harvest strategy development. So that's quite good. And unfortunately, many of the recreational fishing objectives are social. Now, we know and love this, but unfortunately, harvest strategies have a tough time with social objectives because they're often not affected or pushed around by changing harvest, that harvest lever that I mentioned before. The silver lining, though, here was that a number of the social objectives were actually linked to some of the ecological and biological objectives that we may actually be able to achieve. So they're going to be indirectly achieved. And an example of that is, the social objective of having trophy fish in a fishery. If you get your sustainable biomass right and you have a sufficiently high target biomass to aim for, if you indeed get anywhere near that, you're likely to improve your length structures in the population, and therefore you're going to have those trophy fish more available, or at least available at all. So which objectives were most important? So to get at this, I'll just go through this first. So we really need to prioritise those objectives because we keep saying it, can't put all of the objectives into a harvest strategy, unfortunately. We've got to pick the really important ones. So, and this is likely to be stock specific as well. So even though the general lists of objectives for your different stocks were quite similar, depending on the stock status and various other characteristics of the stock, some of those objectives at the time are definitely going to be more important than others, depending on which stock you're looking at. So essentially we got at this using preference surveys. So we applied surveys on the workshop participants, but also the broader recreational fishing community in New South Wales. And they're not particularly complicated. At the core, all they're doing is asking the respondent to rate how important each of the objectives are that we identified before in the workshops on a 9-point scale from not very important through to very important. So you guys have probably filled out similar surveys like this. It's reasonably accessible, but there are some tough decisions in there. For the broader survey of the recreational fishing community in New South Wales, we used a statewide survey and it had two components. So a random stratified telephone component and also a self-selecting website survey. So we just essentially put the survey up on the DPI Fisheries website in New South Wales and anyone who would like to fill it in could. We also collected information on fishing operations and demographics as well. So if there are any differences in objectives priorities among subgroups of the recreational sector, then hopefully we'll be able to tease that out. So we're still working that up at the moment and I'm looking forward to presenting results to that in the future. Next was linking these recreational fishing objectives to existing data sources in New South Wales, Australia. Just getting a handle on whether or not we could actually monitor those objectives we've now identified or whether we need to go find other data sources or build them. So I'll just give you an example here of what we did. We did this for the 41 specific objectives that we identified earlier. And here, this one is maximising the number of legal sized fish caught per fish a day. So the first thing we did was identify performance indicators or variables that might help us track performance against that. Things like retained recreational catch, or if you only had total catch, didn't know it was retained and released, then you might need to add in body length as well. And then we just scoured New South Wales recreational fishing studies that were available through our department from the year 2000 to present to see which of those studies might actually yield this kind of data and allow us to go monitor those things. And you can see here is just this example. We had 5 studies in marine, 5 studies in estuarine and 7 studies in freshwater. And then we also worked out obviously which stocks those data sources had available to them and the spatio-temporal details of the data collection. So we ended up with many data sources really to monitor ecological objectives. This is sort of something we suspected at the beginning. We're getting pretty good at getting, I guess, biological and ecological data from rec fishers these days. We had numerous data sources provide us with time series that we could use to monitor, kind of like that diagram I showed you in the beginning with performance indicators. And we also had quite a few studies. If they didn't produce time series, they offered historical reference points, times in the fishery when things were good, and hopefully we could use those values as potential target reference points for your harvest strategies in the future. Most of the data sources were estuarine and marine. However, there were some excellent emerging time series coming from our freshwater regions as well, and they're only going to get better. And unfortunately, we had few data sources for non-ecological objectives. Now, as we've just pointed out before, a lot of recreational fishing is social, but I think this just highlights how we're kind of getting a handle on ecological and biological collections and data collections, but we're leaving that social and important economic data behind in the data collection. So that's definitely an area we need to work on. So where to from here? Well, lots of places really, but I'll just try and pick out the biggies that were in my mind. The first is equal inclusion of recreational representatives in the harvest strategy development process. If you don't have them in there, you might overlook accidentally the objectives of this sector that happen to differ from other sectors, and instantly you generate inequality and potentially harm performance for that sector who may have a really vested interest in the resource. Related to that, we need to make sure that the supporting management processes around harvest strategies consider a broader range of values. We're really getting a handle now on the ideas of biological, social, economic and even governance objectives and issues in harvest strategies. But I'll just use allocation as an example here. Allocation decisions are often made before you develop a harvest strategy, and often those allocation decisions are made on a far narrower range of values than the harvest strategies actually consider. So often they're made on just catch volume alone. Now you might exclude the recreational sector there, just because it doesn't catch very much in terms of pure volume relative to the commercial sector, for example. But then you exclude that sector on that allocation decision, you don't bring that sector into the harvest strategy development. And that's obviously really dangerous for recreational sector and recreational fisheries because it's not all about catch. So we need to be careful with that. And lastly, the obvious one, formal integration of recreational objectives and potentially their data sources into the functioning harvest strategy. Now, that sort of seems like a no-brainer, but it does raise issues like addressing conflicts between recreational objectives and commercial objectives, or other sectors for that matter. And one way you can get around that is by compromising on reference points explicitly. So if you have your stock biomass indicator here, for example, you might find a commercial sector considers a lower stock biomass to be beneficial, that's their target, but actually the recreational sector wants it right up here because that services more of their objectives to do with having large fish in a population. So explicitly you can accommodate both and in an equal manner pick a reference point that's right in the middle. And there are various other examples, but that's just one. And lastly, do we need recreational data in harvest strategies? It might be that other sectors actually produce fantastic data that does actually allow us to assess fishery performance against recreational objectives. We may not need rec-specific data. However, if we do need it, we need ways to formally integrate it into the assessment along with data sources from other sectors. And one way, as an example, might be to use multi-indicator frameworks. So it's an empirical assessment, and you could potentially take your catch CPUE from recreational fisheries, combine it with your commercial CPUE series, integrate them formally and have them all contributing to your harvest control rule at the other end. So again, more equality and more inclusion there. And I think that's it for me, thankfully. Sorry, Brian. Just a couple of acknowledgements here. The recreational fishers in New South Wales that put all of their heart and soul into those workshops. It was a pretty big undertaking and we couldn't have done it without them, so that's fantastic. And also our steering committee from FRDC, they had recreational representatives on there that also really helped guide this work. And lastly, one of our technicians from New South Wales DPI who had the unenviable task of trawling through very dry harvest strategy documents throughout the globe. So thanks to all of those. Thank you.
Alrighty, thanks very much, Ash. Certainly covered a lot in that, in that presentation. So thank you. No, all good. We'll just allow people to move in and out for a second. Get a bit of fresh air movement in this room. Gets a bit stuffy.
I thought it was uneasy.
Very good. All right, just as people are grabbing their seat, look, I'd like to welcome Simon Conron to give his presentation. Simon's a Victorian Fisheries Authority colleague, and Simon's going to talk to us today about widely sustainable recreational fisheries. So welcome, Simon.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Brian.
Sorry.
Do you want
My job.
Yeah.
That make it easier?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Brian. I'm from the VFA, and just following on from Ash, I've been working in the role of monitoring recreational fisheries for a couple of decades, and I'd just like to acknowledge the team I'm working with today. You might have just heard a presentation from Justin Bell on snapper harvest strategies working on in this room earlier today. So I'm deliberately avoiding snapper in my talk, but I'm going to focus on a couple of other key recreational fisheries that are really important in our wild catch marine fisheries. So that's it. Here in Victoria, where we have policies in place we have for almost a decade that basically strongly support the improving of access of recreational fishers to Victorian fish stocks. This came about around the 2014 election, where the two major parties had a tightly contested election, and prior to that, both parties made a commitment to remove some commercial fishing from our largest fishery and put in investment into recreational fisheries. So it was quite political. Since then, the winning party has made a really big commitment towards improving recreational fishing, $80 million in an attempt to really drive participation in recreational fishing. They've supported that as well with quite a large investment since just after that election in improving boat ramps, and from our surveys we know that access, and particularly boat access and ramps, are one of the key things that motivate recreational fishers at various fishing spots. So as we've mentioned in the science area, that's well and good, but our job in the science area is to ensure sustainability, and we've heard that for a while, and as Ash alluded to, it really is quite similar between commercial fisheries, where we've had a lot of experience, and recreational fisheries, where we're just finding our feet in the last couple of decades. So you can see there the strategies around maintaining abundance, broad size range, monitoring spawning and growth, looking at fishing pressure and sustainability, and then when required, implementing management controls if you need to. So all those things we need to be able to do. As far as performance measures, I'll go through that. There's a lot of work that's been done on that. Our key performance indicator is catch per unit effort. So obviously when the catch for an hour of recreational fishing is going down, that's a proxy for the biomass going down. But also most agencies for the key fisheries do fisheries independent studies. Again, it's catch rate of juvenile fish. And the beauty about that is that if you've got an objective of monitoring spawning success, if you get those abundance measures right, you can forecast how your fishery is expected to perform, and you would have heard a bit about that from Justin today. So for the snapper fishery, we can forecast how it's going to go 7 or 8 years time, so you've got plenty of time to do something. Then you look at fishing pressure again, length composition and fishing effort. Sort of the elephant in the room with recreational fishing is social economic, and it's not all about sustainability. That's important, but we have to step up to the plate for that too, because a lot of those reasons for fishing, like going to a boat ramp, has got nothing to do with actual catching. It's more what's important to anglers. So for Victoria, we're fortunate. We're not like Norway, where you've got those fjords and huge, hard to access, and we're not like other states like New South Wales and Queensland. We've got 4 major recreational marine fisheries. Port Phillip Bay, which we are here now, that's just on the doorstep of Melbourne, and then Western Port, Corner Inlet and the Gippsland Lakes. And if you have a look at, again, a snapshot of the population in 2001, we had 6.5 million a population in Victoria, and most of those, that 6.5 million live in those areas around Port Phillip Bay and Western Port, which is great because anglers like to, the other thing, they like boat ramps, but they like to fish within 50 kilometres of where they live, which is great, but that's signalling a fair bit of pressure going into Port Phillip Bay and Western Port. As part of the election commitment in Port Phillip Bay, the net fishery was removed, and that took about 8 years from that original election commission. So we removed net fishing in Port Phillip Bay, and in recent years, net fishing has been removed from Gippsland Lakes. So the only commercial net fishery now is in Conron Inlet, with Port Phillip Bay being removed to sort of 15, 20 years before that. So that opens it up for recreational fishers, which is a good thing. But we need to collect that fundamental data. And the path that we've gone down is a creel survey, which is a basic survey that as a fisher returns from fishing, they're interviewed at maybe a boat ramp. It's a short interaction, sort of 5 to 10 minutes, and in that time we get the catch rate data, what they were targeting for, the size of fish. We can do counts at the boat ramps. But the beauty about this survey is you've got the 5 to 10 minutes and you've got the person who's made a decision to go fishing that day. So you have that opportunity to collect that valuable social economic data. And that's something that sometimes is overlooked. You have to be quite trained in it because the pressure's on, and you really have to understand what judgments they're making. Is that reasonable? Because other surveys you need a bit more thinking. But, you know, where they've come from and why they went fishing and why they went fishing to that spot for that day, they can tell you that in minutes or even seconds. So a well-structured survey can get that key information. And, you know, that's the gold in this particular method that we've found over the last decade or so. Okay, in the creel survey, we've got those 4 fisheries. We do 240 survey days across those 4 fishes. We've got a quite active group of about 8 or 9 creel survey surveyors. They're paid for by the RFL licence trust fund, so we're really indebted for that support. But this survey has a really high response rate, so 95% of once you walk up to the fisher, in that first part of that interview, you're getting that data. So, and you're not getting that response burden that you may do with online. And we've got a design that makes it more probability based. So now we can look at some other things like effort and those social stuff. The other program we use is an angler diary program. Same sort of information. It's not probability based, but there are some things that the anglers can do, like measure fish below the size limit and collect biological samples, and others at this conference have talked about that, and we're in the process of transitioning to an app. And the other myths I mentioned, that this is good, well supported by our pre-recruit surveys of our juveniles for our key fisheries, and we've got about 4 of them and a few under development too. So what does it look like? Well, this is what we used to get from Port Phillip Bay. This is a catch of King George whiting by a commercial seinet. Effort data was collected from the late 70s. So you can see that this is a catch rate signal that is now, we don't have that data again. So it stopped. But if we have a look at King George whiting is also a great fish for recreationals, and it's been going particularly well in recent years. I'll just get it up. And you can see from our creel surveys, which we started back just after 2002, we had some historical creel surveys like most agencies. You can see the trend is quite similar. And now, in more recent years, with the removal of net fishing, we're heading into new territory. It's contested fish with the commercial net fishery because of habitat, and we're now seeing catch rates, that we haven't seen before, and it sort of signals the method's working pretty well. Again, just what's driving it? Having our juvenile survey of those small whiting, we can track the year classes coming through. So like most estuarine fisheries, you don't get spawning success every year. What you're looking for is consistent pulses. The other thing, as I mentioned, fishing satisfaction. So we've got the probability-based sampling, so we can, for those fishers, we ask some pretty basic questions that most agencies use about why they go fishing, what's important about that area, what that balance between catch and not catch motivations, and then we hit them with how satisfied you are, which is a standard question, and we can get that. So you can see from that, this is for Port Phillip Bay and the regions of Port Phillip Bay, and that Ballerine area near Geelong, that was where the election issue was really hotly contested. It's a King George whiting area. You can see how we're picking up that signal of lower satisfaction in those years around that time, and then kicking back up again, basically 2016, 17, and then all fishing was removed before Port Phillip Bay by 2018 to 19, and then it finished in 20. But you can see how pretty well fishing, and also there was some good whiting year classes going back into that area. So you can see that we can look at that and say, look, satisfaction is going well in that. And it's quite a basic signal compared to some other measures that we do. All right, the effort, again, quite basic again. Sorry, I'll knock that off at the end there. So this again, it's just this signal of from our boat ramp count data. As you might have mentioned, we're moving over to cameras, so we'll have better data. But what that shows that since 2010, we've had a 3% increase sort of year on year going through Port Phillip Bay. Some areas of Port Phillip Bay have been increasing more than others, but it's just gives us a basic signal of more fishing trips over that period. Just moving on for a black bream. I'll just see if I got sort of 5 or 5. Yep. For black bream, I'll just give you a little bit of a, not the best catch rates. And again, this was in our stock assessment process, and nationally through SAFs it was classified as declining. We have a survey for bream, the small bream. It's pretty, basically this species is dependent on river flow. There was low river flows in those areas. In more recent years, we've seen some signal of recruitment, but that's going to take 5 or 10 years to go through. There was basically the VFA have been quite active in management controls. Again, the commercial fishery, net fisheries were removed. They brought in a recovery plan, and a key option for that was a slot limit, consideration of a slot limit. And we use krill survey data for this, because basically you can actually go back and, if you know your size composition, you can actually decide under which size and bag limits what the catch would have been. And just to explain this, it's not well explained, but yeah, we've got a maximum slot limit for bream options for 38 and 40, and you could either have 8 in the slot and 2 above, or 9 in the slot and 1 above, or 10 in the slot and none above. And that's the percentage reduction in catch rate, which is equated to fishing mortality. When the anglers were asked that, and we stood around, they went for the 13.9 reduction, and we brought in that slot. So that was the choice, but it was really important to show that, if you were considering these two, it's not going to make much of a difference, and that was pretty instrumental in the discussion and the choice. Just bringing in the Anglodiris, same fishery for black bream. The beauty of the Anglodiris that they can measure fish in above and below the size limit. You can see the circles, one's in the slot limit and one's above the slot limit. So it's showing us we've got a fair few fish above the slot limit. And actually that fishery is going very well. We've got a world-class bream catch and release competition fishery that they just had their comp a couple of months ago, and for the 3rd year in a row they maxed out on their bag weight for a 5-fish bag weight. The best they get in other estuaries is around, I think it was 7 or 8. The competition. The leader was saying that they're getting 9 and 10, 8 and 9, and I think the best was 5 and 6. So their bag weight's around 2 kilos above any other estuary. So so it's working, I think. So is this working? Look, it's a method that it's short and it's not highly burdensome for the angler. And they really enjoy doing it. We've got really high response rates. It suits the funding to date for the licensed trust fund, because they fund the on-site work and the casuals that are doing the work. And us scientists are funded by government. And the anglers really enjoy getting involved, because when you tell them why you're doing it for sustainability and then you're asking them the social stuff, it's a quick interaction and they feel actually quite good that they've contributed for the day, and also we're using it in stock assessments. So that's it. Thanks. Thank you.
Well done, Simon. Spot on time. Right, I might have listened to N off your name.
Just give them time to get in. Yeah. So how does this work?
So right to go forward, and that one for back, and then that one's your pointer.
So the pointer, okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So could use that bit.
Really that right.
Right to go forward, yeah. Okay.
So people are coming. Is Mark Howarth here? Andrew Howarth, sorry.
Is he?
Anyway, alrighty.
Thanks, Brian. Okay.
You want to introduce yourself?
That's all right, yeah. I'm Julian Pepperell. I've been involved in recreational fishing research for many years, and I'm sort of probably appropriate to give this talk, even though it's my student's talk. Tristan Guilliam, he's sorry he can't be here, but he's in the field working, and we're talking about long-term changes in various aspects of fish resources that we can draw from recreational fishing data. Tristan there on the left, he said he's gutted not to be here, and it's his other supervisor from Macquarie Uni, Jane Williamson, on the right. She's actually on a research cruise too, so she says hello. So this is about looking into the past, and the first 2 points here in terms of any fishery are important to understand past changes, and that's why we do these long-term studies like Simon's just been talking about, gathering data, and because change informs the present and the future, of course, and it's key to managing fisheries if we can understand influences of all sorts of things in the past to what's going to happen in the future. Commercial fisheries, again, like Simon showed in Port Phillip Bay, really good data for because they have to. It's mandatory in most commercial fisheries, of course, to report catches, and these days even with e-log books and cameras on boats, it's even getting more really good data. Whereas, of course, in recreational fisheries, and lots of talks at this wonderful conference have shown that recreational catch data and catch effort data can be very patchy, but the advantage sometimes is that it goes back a long way. So this is the history of the marlin fishery off eastern Australia. It started off in 1913, the first rod and reel capture of a marlin by Dr. Mark Lidwell, his name was, and he caught a small black marlin, about 30 kilograms off Port Stephens, just north of Sydney, and took it to the Australian Museum, and they identified it, and it was skeletonized, and you can still see the skeleton of that marlin in the museum today. The 1920s saw interest in offshore fishing. Of course, the boats didn't go very wide, but they were catching pelagic fish, and a few clubs were formed, but they weren't keeping records of what they caught. This is a real watershed year, 1936, when famous American writer of pulp westerns, very rich, Zane Grey, he came to Australia. He'd heard that there was marlin being caught. He'd already been to New Zealand before that and caught marlin over there. And he came with an entourage of photographers and servants, and he wrote a book about it, actually. Anyway, he spent 3 weeks fishing for marlin off the south coast of New South Wales, and he caught, I think it was 10 striped marlin and 3 black marlin. And the news went like wildfire, and it really generated a lot of interest in the general public. And in fact, the formation of the Game Fishing Association of Australia happened 2 years later, sort of stimulated by this. And that association has administered game fishing around Australia ever since. And I think the current president of GFAA is in the room over there, Ian Bladen. Good to see you, Ian. So it's got quite a legacy. 1953, so we mentioned black marlin, striped marlin. The other Indo-Pacific species of marlin wasn't really recognised to occur off Australia until 1953, when another visiting American angler caught what he thought would look like a Hawaiian marlin, i.e. a blue marlin, and again that was identified as a genuine blue marlin, so that was the first record. Moving on another 20 years later, 50 years to this year ago, the game fish tagging program started up in New South Wales Fisheries, and that program is the largest of its type in the world, and last year the 500,000th fish was tagged on that program, and of that about 110,000 billfish. And that's a very good source of long-term data, of course, as well. Present day, I've just come back from last weekend a tournament at Port Stephens, a game fishing tournament. Port Stephens, you remember, was where Mark Lidwell caught his black marlin. Last weekend they tagged 140 juvenile black marlin, the same size as Dr. Lidwell's fish way back then, and so the fishery is still going strong. So Tristan asked these 2 questions by looking at historic data. Has the species composition of marlin caught changed over time? These are fairly simple questions, and has the size composition changed? Because we have that data. Where do we get the data from? Well, clubs are very well organised in Australia. I was travelled a lot in the United States. They don't seem to be quite so well organised, but for some reason Australian anglers kind of like being in clubs and competing with each other and meeting and talking about fishing, and that's a good thing because they publish for a long time annual reports of the activities of their members, and in those reports, at the back of the reports, every single year there'll be a list of every single fish caught by a member of that club, the date, the size, the actual weight, and the location, even the angler name and the boat name, which is nice for databases to stop double counting. And that was quite a trial to extract, to find all of those annual reports. That took quite a long time in my early career, actually, and we continued to do that, and the clubs cooperated. And there's a few gaps in that data, but there's data from about 20 clubs over that period of time, as I say, starting in 1936. So those records, Tristan, we split this up just latitudinally to look at latitudinal effects on proportions and sizes. So these are the data that he extracted out after he cleaned it all up. 7,300 marlin, that consisting of all 3 species, that were weighed and recorded by clubs, and nearly 80,000 tagged marlin in those data. And so he's analysed that for those 2 purposes. Overall results, this is by year, showing the full extent. This is just the proportion of each species in the catch in any given year. You can see in the early years, when Zane Grey came, he caught lots of striped marlin. You can see that there was a drop-off, and I'll show this a bit further in the talk as well. And the top blue is blue marlin, and you can see a steady increase of that, especially in recent years. And black marlin go up and down, and black marlin catches in a given year can be very much influenced by a strong year class coming through of juvenile, like 1 or 0 plus to 1 plus black marlin as they move down the coast, and they're very coastal. Blue marlin tend to be much more offshore, and in some years there's thousands of these little black marlin come down, and a lot get caught. Just latitudinally, you can see some differences here out of the data. Up north, blue marlin are more prevalent, and well, they are more tropical, and down south, striped marlin are much more prevalent and dominate the fishery right down south. Striped marlin being much more temperate than the other two species. And you see the different timescales there. And just lumping that into pie diagrams just to emphasise the difference in the proportions in the different regions along the coast. So again, this is a bit of a summary. These are decades, the proportions of black marlin in the catch. So it's lovely to have so many decades involved. Blue marlin's interesting because in the earlier days, early parts of the club data, there were quite a few records of blue marlin in the club reports. We think this is almost certainly due to misidentification, because these were quite small fish, which we never see small blue marlin when we know what they look like, and they were caught in the same region in the same season as small black marlin, and they were about the same size. And I did actually ask one of the old club recorders how did they identify that they were blue marlin in those days, and he said, well, they were blue, and that's not a diagnostic feature for blue marlin. But we've left it in there because, you know, we can't be sure, and they did catch some blue marlin because there are some photos of some larger fish that were weighed that were definitely blue marlin in those days. And striped marlin, you can see this really interesting drop of, that's proportions, by the way, so actual numbers would be kind of the reverse of that seesaw. Smaller numbers in early years, but much higher proportion of the catch, and a much larger proportion of the catch in later years. We'll get on to sort of why that might be the case. So this is the size information that Tristan's extracted from on the left, the club records. These are actual weights, and these are mean weights in the box plots. And on the right-hand side is mean estimated weights from the tagging program. The tagging program is a shorter timescale. We'll just, in the interest of time, we'll just look at the black marlin on the left-hand graph. And you can see this, it seems to go down and then up again. It certainly does. In the early days, they did catch larger black marlin, mainly because they were not targeting the juveniles. So that's a true effect. But what you've got to be careful when you look at these sorts of data is what's happened in the regulation of the fishery. You can't just assume that, you know, there's smaller fish or larger fish being caught because that's what was there. And in fact, the New South Wales Game Fishing Association imposed a mandatory minimum size of 50 kilograms for all marlin in 1985. If a club member caught a marlin under that weight and weighed it, they wouldn't get any points for it. So this is all to do with club trophies and competitions, but it certainly had the desired effect of increasing the average size of landed and weighed fish straight away. There's still quite a lot being caught, so they, 5 years later, made another decision to have a higher regulation so that the size limit now is 60 to 80 kilograms depending on the line class used, and that also, you can see, increased the size of black marlin. If you only looked at that data, you would think that the actual size of black marlin in that population had been increasing over those decades. These are decades along the bottom, by the way, not years. But if you look at the right-hand graph, you'll see that the average size of black marlin being tagged hasn't really changed over that time. So they're still there, and luckily the fishers are still tagging them, and we're getting the data that they're there. So you've got to be very careful how you interpret these data. So what's driven these changes? I mean, that's what the big question mark. Tristan is looking into this. Obviously, in any fishery, you have effort creep. You're having increasing efficiency of catching fish increased knowledge of how to catch fish. And in the case of marlin fishing, of course, one of the big factors was boats have got a lot bigger, their range has got much greater. So this explains in some ways why blue marlin are now being caught a lot more, because the bigger boats can go out wider and travel further and spend more money on fuel, but they still do it. And they've also got very good sounders these days, of course. I mean, this is true of all fisheries, and this is available to the recreational sector. And a lot of boats now have very sophisticated, powerful sounders and even side scan sonar. And that's made catching the fish. They can even spot individual marlin now, which is kind of seems a bit unfair. But anyway, that's that's the way the fisheries evolved. But having said that, there may still be underlying changes in the actual abundance, and we know from recruitment of black marlin there certainly are changes, big changes in peaks and troughs of the availability of these fish and the actual the numbers, the absolute numbers. And what influences that? Well, you know, environmental factors obviously, and over such a long time period, we can really look into you know, sea surface temperature effects, La Nina, El Nino effects, and that's what Tristan's looking at to see if that's any of those things are underlying, particularly, you know, this decadal shift in the striped marlin numbers. Striped marlin numbers seem to go up a lot at the end, as you saw. That was partly and maybe wholly due to the fact that fishers worked out how to find them and catch them. Striped marlin are the cooperative feeder, and they'll surround a bait ball, and if you find the bait ball, you find the striped marlin. In the early days, there was not that much awareness of that, and once they became aware of it, okay, they could catch more striped marlin. But it seemed that it was a big change that, and it seemed to me that you know, when I first started going to tournaments in the 1980s, striped marlin were really rare in the catch. If one came in, everybody was really interested to see what it looked like. So in conclusion, so despite the difficulties with recreational data, this study of Tristan's has found that you can really get good information on species composition over time and also size changes over time. That's the end. And Tristan, looking down the nose of a mako shark there, would like to communicate with anybody who wants to. He's very good on social media, very keen fisherman, and you will find him on Insta at Fisho Science. At Fisho Science, yeah. So that's my talk. Thanks.
Andrew.
No, I'm
No worries.
good. How are you doing?
Good. Just get this one sorted.
Okay.
Next one across. Alrighty, there are a couple of seats up here if you wanted, or stand up beside you. Got a cool crowd, mate.
Yeah.
Still the room.
It's nice and warm.
It's nice and warm. Alrighty, thank you, everyone. We've got our last presenter for this session now, Andrew Howarth. Andrew's going to talk to us about non-probabilistic survey methods for fisheries users. So, welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to look to wrap up this session, hopefully do a good job of it by talking a little bit about non-probabilistic methods in the human dimensions of fisheries. I'm not going to talk so much about specific methods, but rather I want to focus on the methodological strengths of these approaches and where they work, where they don't, and maybe make some suggestions about best practices. So I started this work and was supported the way through it by Len Hunt, who I interned with as part of what's called the FishCast program. Len's a research scientist in my home province of Ontario. He's awesome when it comes to human dimensions work, quantitative methods, a bunch of other things. So really appreciate Len. I'll quickly make the case for human dimension stuff. This is obviously the other side of the equation when it comes to managing a natural resource, fishery, anything else. We need to know about the resource health, abundance, but we also need to know about how people are affecting it by indirect and direct means. Survey research is a great way to do that. Surveys are already prevalent in fisheries. We have national surveys of rec fishing, which have been discussed plenty this week. There are creel surveys that are more specific to regions and fisheries, lots of academic research. Surveys are versatile. There are a bunch of best practices that allow us to get good info out of our respondents. And when surveys go biased, it typically happens for one or more of 4 reasons. We have sampling, coverage, measurement, and non-response error. But when it comes to non-probabilistic approaches, those first 2, sampling and coverage, and to an extent non-response error, are most relevant. Surveying looks a little bit different today too than it did 10, 20, 30 years ago, and this has a lot to do with technological change. On one hand, we have new opportunities provided by the saturation of smartphones and internet, but at the same time, things like spam make it difficult to maintain high response rates and all sorts of other things. So to really crudely simplify it, probabilistic methods are sort of the gold standard in survey research. This involves sampling randomly from a known population across any relevant strata within that population. Often this is by mail or by phone. And the big benefit of this is it's statistically robust. We can, if done properly, generate accurate population estimates and other inferences. The downside of this is it just takes a ton of time and money to do a really good one, especially in a place like Australia or Canada. Non-probabilistic methods, on the other hand, are sort of like the statistical purists' forbidden fruit, right? We're sampling non-randomly from often an unknown population. When you hear words like convenience, purposive, snowball, panel, you're probably dealing with some form of a non or quasi-probabilistic survey design. And the downside of this approach is it's bias prone, but the upside is that we can do it quickly and cheaply. So when I started the review that I'm going to talk about here, I had a few questions in mind. First of all, I wanted to really determine where these methods had been used in the human dimensions of fisheries. I wanted to know if those usages were, generally speaking, appropriate, or maybe a better way to put it would be optimal. And I wanted to know going forward how these methods could be used to greatest effect. So these search strings turned up some stuff. Not a lot of methods papers dealing specifically with this question, a lot of stuff circling around it, and a lot of actual non-probabilistic surveys in this area. A lot of good work, but to my eye, and I think maybe some others, a lack of very clear discussion of exactly why these methods are used and what you can and can't get from them. The other thing I did is lean really heavily and pull selectively from literature and other disciplines like health science and marketing, where a lot of really good lessons have been learned about non-probabilistic methods, what you can do with them. And what I want to show today is, broadly speaking, what that looks like in a fisheries context, what we should be focusing on. So a lot of the existing research involves niche groups. Recreational fishers, especially the avid and specialized subgroups of this group, are a big one. There's also small-scale, commercial, and subsistence fisheries. Also key informants. These are, topic experts that might convene at a conference, and they can be surveyed about a specific issue that they have deep knowledge on. A lot of other research involves these phenomena, whether it's documenting them or really describing them in depth. There's a lot of value in this. Technologies and citizen science are a huge area with tons of interest, tons of potential, and for very good reason. Things like angler apps, online surveying more generally, and digital self-reports, I would say, have a ton of potential and are already changing the way we manage and research fisheries. Various forms of citizen science, whether it's conducting it or evaluating it, lots of research there. And then patterns in fishing. A lot of these are preliminary inquiries, but every now and then you see a non-probabilistic survey design applied to a large-scale general phenomena, which this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, and I'll talk more about that. Because of course, the big limitation when it comes to this method relates to generalizability. We don't know the precision and accuracy of most non-probabilistic samples, and we can't know for multiple reasons. If we're lacking a sampling frame, we don't know our response rate, so on and so forth. And when it comes to something like an online voluntary participation survey of rec fishers, avidity biases are huge. Depending on the design, you might see transiency, volunteerism, biases. Even in quasi-probabilistic panels, you have professional respondents and things that can confound those results. Bias reduction and mitigation. This is sort of an art and science that is rapidly progressing. There's a lot of exciting work happening in this area. I don't think it's unfair, though, to say that these methods are pretty limited as it currently stands. You know, we can compare non-probabilistic data to benchmark probabilistic data and get a sense of how things are biased, but a lot of those are sort of informal and limited methods. We can, before collecting data, improve what we get by, you know, recruiting widely, using multiple modes, incentivizing. And then after the data is collected, we can even manipulate the data with techniques like weighting, quotas, score adjustment. But I don't think it's unfair to say that, just generally speaking, painting with a really broad brush, these methods aren't far enough advanced to just take any non-probabilistic sample and render something generalizable from them. Although, yeah, I'm hopeful about that. So where research questions and objectives are sort of at odds with research methods, we end up with what I've taken to calling awkward surveys. So these are surveys with sort of low inferential power because, for example, we take non-representative data and we try to answer questions that would require representative data to at least answer with a high degree of certainty and precision. And then, you know, at the end of the surveys, you just end up saying, you know, sort of wishy-washy answers, which, you know, I guess the time is better spent if the question's different. In addition to that, there's also the problems of digital sprawl and ethical concerns and risks in an online setting, because a lot of non-probabilistic surveys and methods are sort of synonymous with online research. And of course, we've got a technological landscape that's already complex, but it changes every year. It's hard to survey across those devices. It's hard to retain respondents, let's say, in you know, an Angler app context. It can be expensive and time-consuming to get these things off the ground. And then, yeah, the whole issue of digital privacy, that's exacerbated by distrust, say, between users and managers. And then institutions like research ethics boards and universities have yet to adapt to this method of surveying in a lot of cases. So the essential consideration here is fitness for use. Survey researchers have to make compromises a lot of the time because the gold standard large-scale probabilistic survey isn't always realistic, and yet we need to make decisions. So what's ideal isn't always what we end up having to make decisions based on. So I'll turn now to the opportunities for, I think, valid and insightful research in the human dimensions using non-probabilistic methods. There's sort of 4 categories here that I see anyway. So niche subgroups, I've already talked a little bit about these. They have differential impacts on fishery resources. We've all heard the saying about 10% of the anglers catching 90% of the fish. And in a lot of the broad and shallow survey approaches we use, these groups are insufficiently captured. And like I said earlier, we often lack the sampling frame to really go in and rigorously investigate them. But approaches like respondent-driven sampling provide a way into these hard-to-reach groups and allow us to probe deeply into them and learn something that we might not otherwise learn, which can then inform either moderate or low-stakes regulatory decisions, follow-up studies, things like that. And here the key methodological strength is access, just getting into these groups that are otherwise hard to penetrate. Niche phenomena, like niche groups, are absolutely numerous and diverse in fisheries. A lot of the times, well, I guess the most important thing to say here is that niche doesn't mean irrelevant, right? If we talk about something like the consumption of an at-risk species, like a at-risk eel species, this was found in one non-probabilistic survey that you know, anglers were retaining and consuming a protected species, or, you know, to use an example from yesterday's talks, shark depredation on tarpon. Yes, these are limited in space and time, but they're very, very relevant if we're interested in managing and conserving our fisheries. So in this case, non-probabilistic methods like purposive or expert sampling allow us to zoom in on these and capture some of what our conventional large-scale probabilistic surveys don't. I'm by no means advocating for the replacement of one with the other. What I'm much more interested in and what I think make much more sense is to use these two in conjunction with one another. And yeah, I've basically covered it, but the methodological strengths here would be acuity and just zooming in on something that's relevant. So this is where things get a little bit more tricky. When it comes to general phenomena, non-probabilistic methods aren't always the intuitive or optimal approach. Again, we don't want, or we're limited in our ability to say things about full populations or make population estimates when our sample data aren't necessarily representative. But we might not have the best data and we might need to start somewhere. So in this case, I think non and quasi-probabilistic data provide really, really high quality starting points for research. Again, this can inform moderate and low stakes regulatory decisions. I'm aware that I'm speaking in the adaptive management section, and I think a great opportunity to use potentially biased data in an experimental way would be in an active adaptive management context where we're making decisions, observing the outcome, and then adjusting accordingly. And here the major strengths are cost efficiency and timeliness. Basically, we can start studying an issue earlier and we can respond more swiftly and in a more informed way to things as they emerge, whether they're COVID-19 pandemics or they're just things that we haven't studied enough. So the last category that I think where there's real methodological strengths in non-probabilistic sampling that make a ton of sense is various supplementary roles. As I've already mentioned, conventional probabilistic data capture a lot of key aspects of fishing, but they miss others, like concentrated fishing effort. Again, this is the 5–10% of anglers catch 90–95% of the fish type thing, right? We need to know something about these groups, and if we survey too widely and, I guess, shallowly, we learn a lot of good stuff, but we miss a couple things that we could get with a non-probabilistic approach, like a recapture design. Recapture survey designs can, for example, estimate the size of a specialized subgroup and their impact on a fishery. And I think the most promising use of this kind of non-probabilistic data is as a supplement, as a support to the conventional probabilistic data that already exists, right? You can add this to a model or a decision-making process that is fitted to probabilistic data and essentially have a wider and more accurate view of what fishing looks like on the landscape. So I think the main message that I have today is that there's really no shortage of opportunity in the human dimensions of fisheries to play to the methodological strengths of non-probabilistic surveys and avoid these awkward matchings of sort of general questions with very focused approaches. What I've tried to do is highlight them. The statement that I kind of want to close on, or almost close on, I guess, is data are really powerful. I think it's not unfair to say that it really is the researcher's ultimate responsibility to collect, analyze, and represent data in ways that are valid and responsible, because those go out into the public, and the public has, a variable level of statistical literacy, and so do individuals in our community. And yeah, poorly representative data go out there like pillows or feathers out of a broken pillow. They fly around, they're impossible to reel in once that's the case. So we don't want to create big messes that we can't clean up by surveying non-thoughtfully, I guess. So to really wrap things up, when it comes to niche groups, non-probabilistic methods give us a road in. When it comes to niche phenomena, non-probabilistic methods let us zoom in. When it comes to general phenomena, they let us get off the starting line in a more informed and rapid way. And when it comes to the things that we're already doing, like modeling, recreational fisher, spatial patterns, effort, things like that, they deepen our understanding and allow us to act, more informed way and basically see things at a higher resolution. Yeah, I guess I'll restate the example again because I think it is the perfect one, not just for my talk, but for this conference. It's the 5 to 10% of recreational fishers who, account for however many 90–95% of the fishing effort. And I've met a bunch of those people here. A couple of them are in the room, and they also like to drink, and I'm probably going to do that with them later, I guess. So that's it for me.
Alrighty. Thanks very much, Andrew. We'll now have our questions, so if I can ask the four speakers to come and grab a chair up the front. Oh, thanks, Lon. Cheers, mate. Just, do you activate it or not?
Testing, yeah.
Is there another one for the questions or not? No, it's just the one. No worries. All right. Sorry, anyone got any questions of our speakers? Oh, yeah. We've got John back in the centre there.
I'll start with you, Ash. I think it was a great presentation there. What challenges or how did you go conveying the ideas of stock assessments to a recreational angler group who may not necessarily be fully aware of that? You've obviously did a great presentation here. Was there challenges there? Was it quite easy? Was it intuitive to different stakeholders?
I think I'll just be honest and say we didn't really try. We've got various platforms.
Sorry, just get in talk in the mic.
Live streaming, we need to use the microphone, please.
Yep. So I guess in some ways in those situations we didn't really try. The main aim of there was to get their objectives and note, I guess, how we might incorporate them, not necessarily in their data form and an assessment, but just to make sure that those objectives would be compared and contrasted with those of other sectors in harvest strategy development. I think it's possibly another step to get stakeholders to really understand how the data might be incorporated. So how for example, the data that recreational fishers provide, how that might be actually incorporated into a multi-sectoral assessment for a particular stock. And it sort of gets a bit confusing too, because we tend to think about stock assessments where we really want to drill down on exactly what's going on with the stock itself. But in harvest strategies, the term assessment is far more broad, as we saw there before. We use some of those basic examples, I think, that I showed you just to give them an idea that, you know, if we did have an indicator like their catch per unit effort, you know, it goes up and down and there are various comparisons with those reference points. But in terms of really giving a good understanding of how it might enter into a model-based stock assessment, we left that one alone. Yeah.
It's just up the back. Oh, yeah.
Hello, Simon. I'd just like to ask about your catch rate indices as predictors of fishery performance and biomass. So there's a few examples around the world of hyperstability in catch rates when you've got recreational fishers with increasing fishing power and all of a sudden things fall off the cliff really quickly. Do you have any comments or thoughts on what you might be planning on doing to test whether that's going to be a like, have you done any, what do you think that that's going to be something that you have a look at as something important to test against to see whether the stocks are going okay or not, or any comments on that?
Even though we're so close, I've gone away. Yeah, exactly. And recreational, that from when it first started, when we said we're going to monitor recreational catch rates, you know, basically said, well, that won't work. Not only for hyperstability, but how do you trust them on when they fished and where they fished and all that sort of stuff. Multiple lines of evidence is the way to go with that, and we were fortunate in the fact that we had commercial fisheries that were still going for, 10 or 20 years. In the case of Port Phillip Bay, we've got a longline, commercial longline fishery that's for snapper. There is some hyperstability with that because they can follow the stocks because they're fishing every day, but when you've got fluctuating year classes going through over, decades, you can see that sensitivity. Also, you've got that link between pre-recruits and recruits. So and you have also angler diary program, krill survey. So in some ways, you have about 3 or 4, and you've got your local knowledge and people have worked in it. So, that's the task. Not models, trying to use data. That's where we've gone.
Just up the back again, mate. Making you walk.
Hi, another question for Simon. It's Bryce Stewart here. We used to work together about 25 years ago.
You may not recognise me, but anyway. Yeah, actually following up on that catch punitive effort story for King George Whiting. So I noticed that was mentioned by the Minister in the opening address about how they banned netting and now there's this increase in catch punitive effort. But I guess the question is, how sure are you that that's because of the ban? It seemed to be going up in the commercial fishery as well. Maybe are you monitoring fish sizes, etc., etc.? So, yeah, I can imagine there's a bit of political pressure to tell a good story, but of course we have to do the right science as well, don't we?
Work clock.
It's really good because you get a time to think in this stuff, so that's good. But absolutely. So when we had a look at it, yeah, you could see that catch rates were going up in the commercial fishery, but we know that, you know, basically it's, you know, the way this fishery works is that commercial netters and the recreationals fish side by side because the King George Whiting, as you know with your work, that it's a seagrass affinity with, so that's been going on for, you know, 50 years, you know, so you can see that. But, you know, once the commercial fishing stopped, you get, and we're only a couple of years into it, it's sensible that, you know, basically it's a new start really for fishing. So we've got a 5% increase in recreational, or in that area, in Port Phillip Bay, in trips. But, you know, it is a new start. So our baseline, you know, will start again. But definitely, yeah, they're getting more access to those stocks now.
Simon. Probably got one as well. Might affect more of the first three presentations, but thinking about the impacts of COVID, and you know, you're relying on angler data or meetings, and you use the hybrid or the online meeting. I think Ash, in yours, potentially in some ways, is that allowed access for more people to come to your meetings, or and has it restricted any data for Julian or Simon in that you haven't, you know, people weren't fishing as much, and maybe that's more a Victorian thing because we were locked down for a bit, but. Yeah.
Yeah, I know a bit about this because I was the facilitator of these workshops, these online workshops that Ash called me up and asked me to do that, and I said, yep, you have to pay me though, but that was fine. And yeah, it was quite tricky, I must say, because people were all over the place, and because they're recreational anglers, this is the important point. It was more convenient for them to do it after hours, so we did all of these workshops either before dinner, and lots of them had kids at home and everything, or after dinner, and the after dinner ones were pretty tricky. We got, you know, a fair bit of attrition through time, but you know, we had the same panel really, but for each species we had separate groups of sort of experts, and I must say it worked pretty well. I mean, they did persist through time, and I think that they went for several weeks, these workshops, and you know, people turned up on cue and handled the technology pretty well, and you know, they would break up into you know, virtual groups and then come back into the room and report what they'd found, and they did participate really well. So I was a bit dubious to start with, to tell you the truth, but I think it worked much better than I thought it would.
Yeah, pretty much what Julian's outlined there. I was also sceptical at the time. We just had no choice. We'd already put things off for a long period of time. And actually, if you looked at it in hindsight, our ability to get representativity and people from all over the state contributing multiple hours per week in most cases of their time, I think this is possibly one of the few ways we could have done it and really retained those individuals for the amount of time that we had them. So I think it sort of forced a bit of ingenuity and learning there, and I think we're probably better off for it.
Yeah, it gave them more time in between as well to think about what had happened in the previous workshop, whereas a one-off in the room, you know, it's just banging us all over. Yep. And
also, I mean, the opportunity to turn up for your after-dinner session with a rum and coke in hand was certainly uptaken by a couple of individuals, so that was very nice and casual. And
in a coffee cup.
That's that's what I said, coffee.
Very good. All right, I've got a couple other questions up the back.
Who was first? Thanks, I'm John Holdsworth. I enjoyed all those presentations, excellent. A question for Ash. We're trying to sort out management targets for rock lobster in New Zealand, and it's really quite polarised. And there's sinking baselines, I think, there's recreational fishers are interested in a higher biomass, larger fish. Commercial want maximum sustainable yield and no cuts to their quota. And I think another component, have you considered putting in ecologists or ecosystem into your target assessment, because that is becoming critical in some of these fisheries that have been at a low level for so long that we're just used to it.
Yeah, it's a very, very tricky thing, really. I mean, I think dealing with the conflicts between stakeholders, you can do it in that sort of brute force way that I mentioned, where you divide all your reference points down the middle. And unfortunately, sometimes the gap between them is too high. An alternative way to do it is to actually include some decision analysis in there. So you can actually come up with alternative harvest, rather than focusing on all the components. You just come up with alternative harvest strategies, could be 3 or 4 or just 2, and you actually get your stakeholders to independently, hopefully as much as you possibly can, rank those harvest strategies on the basis of their own merits, and actually compare and contrast between the groups, and hopefully you get some common ground on which of the harvest strategies they prefer. And I mean, not to hide in the detail, but the harvest strategy options that are available to you are probably multifactorial, such that it's not just the target reference point necessarily. There's probably all sorts of other things that you might be able to chop and change on it, and people have disagreements on. So you end up with, 3 or 4 different harvest strategy packages. And then you put those to the group and actually allow them to tell you which one is preferable. It's a bit like what we did with the objectives in some ways, but I've seen that done before. It's been done in the Queensland inshore fishery, I think. There's a paper available on that by Sean Pascoe, and that seems quite useful, and they actually found more common ground than they expected, despite what they did think which was going to happen, which was extreme polarisation. So, yeah.
Thank you. Back left. Yep.
Thanks. I'm Rod Poon from Natural Resources Environment Tasmania. Yeah, really great talks. Just one thing, John, about with rock lobster harvest strategies. I just wondered about the spatial, doing spatial management. So can you have like different targets and performances for some areas? I mean, you've obviously got this recreational only areas, and you've bought out areas and bays which are quite similar. So that wasn't going to be my question though. But I just sort of picked it up, so I wouldn't mind discussing that. And the other one was just discussing with the groups that you set up. Did you, with the groups, were they just self-select random sort of groups when they're online, or did you group people according to, say, location or specific issues at all? Thanks.
Thanks for the question. So we're talking about the workshops themselves? Yeah. So really, in that sense, we're sort of limited to experts already known to the department and had been assisting with other projects and other management scenarios in the past. So in that sense, you'd argue it's a pretty biased selection of people. The way we tried to get around that in the workshop was to ask them to think about their broader constituents. And a number of these individuals were involved in various club fishing. Some of them were celebrities in and of themselves in the recreational fishing environment, and very aware of a lot of the opinions and information that were available from recreational fishers in general. So we asked them to think in the workshop, when they're coming up with their lists of objectives, try and think broadly. Don't just think because you want to catch mulloway on fly that everybody else does. Try and think what a mulloway fisher, a bread and butter mulloway fisher might want to, what would they find important? Is it actually more about consumption? So in that sense, we did our best to cover that bias, but there's really not much we could have done in that sense. What we then do is, with the survey, and particularly the random stratified component of the broader statewide survey, that's when we have our list of objectives, and in that sense, that's where we think we're getting more representative data about which objectives these fishers find more important than others. So that's where we're trying to combat that. But yes, it's a great question, and I don't really know. I mean, the amount of hours that we spent trying to identify people who would come to 14 hours of online lecture, I mean, seminars, it's really, really difficult. So we were actually lucky to get the 20 or so fishers we got with the experience in the room, yeah.
Very good. Any further questions? Any other comments you guys like to make? No. One more question, sorry. Thanks, John.
I've got a question for you, Andrew. So in the process of your literature review there, you've obviously gone through and formally assessed. There's these biases. What proportion of published studies had what you'd call fundamental flaws in the interpretation of the data or the way they've gone about it, that people are just not aware of them? So like in terms of fundamental flaws, in terms of the methodology they did in the inference drawn, because you've gone through and obviously looked at all these is it a big problem?
Hang on, have a think time.
How slow do you want me to walk?
I think he's got it there. Get it there.
Yeah. So fatal flaws is probably harsher than I would have said about any one of the studies. What I saw in the category of studies that involved general patterns in fishing were probably a handful of studies. I don't know the percentage off the top of my head that probably could have generated more, I guess, more certain answers had they asked different questions. The thing that I've noticed over and over, and I think this is a good thing overall, is that there's a lot of traditionally trained biologists and ecologists now interested in doing human dimensions research, but aren't trained in those methods. And, neither am I, because I'm not finished my degree, but I can see just by looking at them with the knowledge I do have that there are enhancements to be made there. I think this is the high-level guidance and sort of simplified heuristic sort of direction that they might benefit from, where instead of asking a question that you can't really solve by posting a survey on Facebook or, mailing it out to the members of like a cottage, I forget the term for it, but essentially a very narrow slice of the recreational fishing population. I think they're, where you're limited in what you can do survey-wise and you have to do one of those surveys, you can actually get something really good as opposed to something kind of wishy-washy just by changing the question a little bit. In other words, we don't need to learn something general for it to be meaningful. We can learn something very specific, and that can be paired with more general knowledge that in Canada we already get from the RecFisher survey as a support and an enhancement rather than a substitute. And I think that's kind of the when I say individuals who aren't trained in those methods sort of wielding those methods awkwardly, it's usually, they're substituting rather than adding non-probabilistic methods and data to what already exists. So, I hope that's an answer.
Thank you. One last question here at the front, just behind you.
Hi. I just want to make a comment. I saw some of the papers that you put in the presentation. I read some of them. And I think a lot of them, the results are more descriptive and qualitative than quantitative. So they're not trying to estimate anything. They're basically just showing the app data, the internet data, the non-probabilistic data. So I guess I wanted to ask you, do you have any examples where those data, the non-probability data, got combined with the probability data to actually provide estimates in terms of catch, effort, things like that? Do you have any examples that you've seen that was successful in your personal point of view?
Yeah, I could think of. I'm trying to think of a good example that's really fits what you described. There may be one that I'm not remembering properly. What jumps to mind, I guess, my supervisor, Vivian Nguyen, does a lot of qualitative research. And where it comes in as a support, her research specifically, this is like not a sweeping statement, but where her research comes into the management decision-making process is in going into, like an example for her would be the Fraser River and doing a real in-depth, narrow but deep study of, let's say, the indigenous subsistence fishery there, and understanding something really complex like their philosophies about self-governance or something like that that doesn't really lend itself to qualitative or quantitative study, but allows the decision maker to, who's already cognizant of catch rates and things like that, to, I guess, intervene more successfully and with fewer adverse effects in, a problem like bycatch of steelhead by sockeye salmon fishers there. So when it comes to qualitative research, there's this big breadth-depth trade-off, and yeah, the real advantage of it is gaining deep insight on something complex and multifaceted, and yeah, that's key to a lot of those interventions, because if you take an uninformed approach to them, you step on rakes and things like that.
Alrighty. Sorry, is there a comment there on that? Okay.
Because I have a example where we're actually have used or working to use that at NOAA Fisheries. For a lot of our stock assessments, our recreational data collections get numbers of fish harvested, numbers discarded, and for the harvested fish we get size data, but we don't have any size data on discarded fish. So we've started using some of these applications, citizen science projects, to collect size data on discards, recreational discards, and we're actually working to incorporate that into some of our stock assessments. And so while that's not quite probabilistic data, we find that with enough data, we can still get a fairly representative understanding of what the size structure of the discarded fish within a fishery are. So.
All right, very good. Thank you. Look, yeah. Thanks everyone for your hold the applause now. Thanks everyone for your engagement through these sessions. Obviously, getting quite warm here this hour, but the interest and the discussion here at the end is just great. Like, we had one less speaker than some of the other sessions, but we're taking up the time with questions, which I think has been really valuable. So, thanks everyone for your interaction, and a big thank you, Andrew, Simon, Ash, and Julian, for your preparation and presentations today. So now let's declare. Good job. All right, you can go enjoy some afternoon tea and the wrap up after that. Thanks everyone.
Sure. Yes.